Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 263 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Across the world, there's no shortage of contested sites where local identities, national identities, and international politics clash, often with high stakes for the people who live there. When it comes to the modern politics of European cities, medieval history tends to carry a lot of weight, so understanding this history is a matter of vital importance. One place with a long and tangled history of West meets East is a beautiful port city on the Baltic Sea, the capital of Latvia, Riga. This week, I spoke with Kevin C. O'Connor about the medieval city of Riga. Kevin is professor of history at Gonzaga University and the author of the History of the Baltic States, Culture and Customs of the Baltic States, and Intellectuals and Apparatchiks, Russian Nationalism and the Gorbachev Revolution. His latest book is The House of Hemp and Butter, A History of Old Riga. Our conversation on the founding of Riga, its tumultuous place as the site of trade between the West and the East, as well as war between bishops and crusaders, and how its medieval history plays out in today's politics is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Kevin, for joining me to talk about Riga. It's so nice to meet you and to get to talk about a city that I don't think we've talked about on this podcast, so welcome.
Thank you for having me, Danielle. I'm looking forward to this chat.
So you have just made sure that I'm aware, and maybe we'll make everyone aware, that you're a modernist and you're just like coming into our world to enjoy and explore. So welcome to our world.
Yeah, it's funny how I find myself in this position of being interviewed on the Medieval podcast when I don't really consider myself a medievalist. I'm trained as a modern Russian historian who focused on the Soviet period. But life takes its twists and turns, as life in academia in particular. And early in my career, I had an opportunity to do some work on the Baltic states. And that led me down the path to writing my first book about the history of the Baltic states and developing this fascination with the city of Riga, which I had the occasion to visit because of the research I was doing on the Baltic states. And I kind of fell in love with the city and started reading about it, trying to discover its history. And I discovered that the English language historiography on Riga is really, really thin.
Mm-hmm.
And so I saw an opportunity to do something here. So my intention, in fact, was to write a modern history of Riga. I had visited there for the first time in 2002, and I was just blown away by the beauty of this city. And it wasn't so much the medieval city that got my attention at that time. It was the part of the city outside the medieval core where the late 19th and early 20th century bourgeoisie built their fancy homes in the Jugendstil, that is the Art Nouveau style. And so it was the streets around Elisabetta Jela and Alberta Jela that really attracted my attention. And I thought I'd like to do something about the modern history of Riga. But I wanted to do an introduction that would explain the earlier history. And so the introduction, I was writing for myself to just get the ball rolling. And I was trying to tell myself the story of Riga from the beginning and just in a very abbreviated way. And as I was telling myself the story, it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. And next thing you know, I've been spending a year reading about the Northern Crusades. And so that's how the book actually developed. It developed piece by piece. And then I got to the point where I thought, this is going to be much too large to include the modern period in Riga. And so I need to figure out a place to cut this off and then maybe someday return to the modern Riga part. So that's how I ended up with a book that focused on the foundations of Riga, the Middle Ages, and going up through the early modern era up until the Russian conquest in the early 1700s.
Well, this is how we get you. This is how we get you into the Middle Ages, just by being so interesting. You just can't help it, right?
It's fascinating. I'm loving it.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that. And I think that it's especially important if you're going to write a modern history, especially in an area that has been tangled up with Russia, because right now we have the Russian state building up narratives that go back to the Middle Ages. So I don't think you can understand a place like Latvia without understanding the actual city in the Middle Ages, and then how that is used and weaponized in a lot of different ways by modern states. So I think that this is absolutely the right approach as a modernist to really understand the history. So I think you're going to have a lot of fans here because you're going into that detail, which I think is essential.
There is absolutely a conversation taking place about Latvia and its position in the world and its relationship with Russia, its relationship with the West. And my book weighs in on that to a certain degree by establishing Riga's foundations as being firmly part of the Western world, which is not to say that Russia does not have a relationship with the city and the region. But yes, you're right. History has a way of being weaponized. And my aim was to address the narratives that exist about Riga, especially in the context of this book, early Riga. So when I was doing the research, for example, I'm reading historians who are writing from their national perspective. The earliest historians of Riga were Germans. They wrote in German and they wrote about the German history of Riga, naturally enough. So their histories tended to leave out the Latvians, to leave out the indigenous peoples, and to focus on the achievements of the political history we're talking about, right? Archbishops, knights, and German merchants. Then, after Latvia got its independence and Latvia began to train its own historians, what we see is a different narrative emerging whose purpose is to reclaim the agency of the indigenous peoples. That is the Latvian tribes, the Livonian tribes, and then further north, the Estonian tribes and other surrounding peoples. And so their views were, I wouldn't say as strident as the Germans, and maybe strident isn't even the right word, but assertive, right? That is, we're asserting that Riga has been a Latvian city and it has Latvian origins. And of course, there are Russian books that don't necessarily make the claim that Riga is historically a Russian city, but they do make the claim that there were Slavic tribes living in the region, and that just enters the Russian narrative and it bolsters Russian claims to having interests in the region that are historical going back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah. I mean, we see this sort of backward looking way of establishing a mythos around a state all the time, all the time. Okay, so let's get back to medieval Riga. So, as you say, there are all sorts of indigenous tribes around there just kind of hanging out. And this city is intentionally established by German colonizers in a place that's kind of an odd place to build, right? Like the indigenous people had kind of left this area alone for a bunch of reasons. So, start us at the beginning. What is Riga like around 1200? And then how does it get established?
So, at the moment that German crusaders and missionaries arrive in the area of Riga in the late 12th century, the region was sparsely inhabited by Livonian tribes, and neighboring them were Latvian tribes. Now, we have to be careful with the use of the word Latvian because in those days there was no Latvia, but there were tribes like the Kurlanders, like the Semigallians, Latgalians, who spoke a dialect that we can identify as Latvian. Livonians different because the Livs or the Livonians spoke a Finno-Ugric language that is closer to Estonian. So in that region, when the Germans arrived there, they would have found sparsely populated settlements of peoples who have not reached a mature level of political development to the point where we can say that they have the kind of hierarchies that exist in European states, that is, kings and princes. And so we have to be very careful about using these kinds of words to describe the leaders of these tribes. As far as the physical geography of the environment, it's very sandy and wet. The opening words of my book are Riga is built on water.
Mhm.
And that's what you see in the folk tales. The folk tales are called dinas. They're these stories written in a kind of poetic form that were sung by folk singers and still up to modern times. And they often drop clues about the perception of Riga from the perspective of peasants who live outside the city. And what they see is a city that is built on water, surrounded by sand, and there are sand dunes all over the place. So it's not a very promising area for agricultural development, for example. But what attracted the traders to the region was the fact that there is a river. The Germans called it the Duna. The Latvians called it the Daugava. The Russians called it the Dvina, right? It's all the same river. And that river is in the Bay of Riga in the Baltic Sea, and it leads into the hinterland, which goes into Russia. So there's the part of that connection there as well. So traders had been coming up into that region. Vikings had been making that, had been traveling that route to the lands that became Rus lands going back to the ninth century. But by the 1100s, German merchants are beginning to arrive in this region and they're establishing trade contacts with the locals. And this coincides with a thrust by the church to bring its crusades to the north. As we all know, the Crusades have been going on for quite some time by the 1150s, and they aimed towards the Middle East, or I should say the Near East, rather, the Reconquista in Spain as well. But the Northern Crusades is kind of overlooked. It doesn't get quite as much attention, but it was getting the attention of religious leaders in the Catholic Church in the 12th century who thought it would be a good idea to bring the word of God to the pagans who lived just beyond the reach of Germandom, that is along the Baltic Sea, the Baltic coast, where Prussia is today, where Latvia is today, where Estonia is today. And so what we have are two parallel things going on here. We have the mercantile thrust, that is merchants who want to make some money. We have the religious thrust, that is the idea of Christianizing or bringing Christianity to these distant lands. Not so distant, I suppose. And then, of course, the need to defend all the gains made by the merchants and the bishops, that is, and so that's where the knights come in. So it's an environment where the locals were weak and disunited, and it wasn't all that hard for outsiders who have greater force, greater organization, and a stronger sense of mission to come in and establish dominance over the locals. And so that
Yes.
unfolds over a series of decades in the 13th century.
Yeah, and that's why you refer to this as being a colonial city, because once they're established there, they're trying to bring culture and trade and all that stuff from Germany and impose it on that area, right?
That's right, exactly. So there's a mission to baptize the Livs, baptize the Latvian tribes, and it's a real struggle. The first chapter, or maybe it's the second chapter of my book, details some of these struggles. And this is where all the legends, the earliest Latvian legends, emerge from this period as well. And these legends surround resistance to the outsiders. And we know about these thanks to chronicles that were published much later, but that were written back in the 13th century. So you might have come across in reading my book, Henry of Livonia. Henry of Livonia, he was writing to help the church understand what was going on in the crusade in Riga or in the areas around Riga. And it's such an informative text because it tells us about the battles, it tells us about the confrontations, it tells us about the mindset of the crusaders as well, that they perceived what they were doing in religious terms, that the people that they were trying to reach were in the grips of some kind of satanic force in a sense, and they were being liberated from their illusions by bringing them Christianity and thereby also being brought into the civilized world as well. So it's part of a civilizing mission, we might say.
Which is a tale as old as time, isn't it?
Absolutely, right? And as bloody and as violent as any other civilizing mission, right? It
Hmm.
took a long time as well. That is, the Crusades were effectively over in the Latvian lands by 1290, by the end of the 13th century. But it took many centuries for the peasants living in the region to fully embrace Catholicism. So there are residual elements of paganism in the countryside right up through the 1500s. Much like in the Ruslands, I'm actually in some ways more familiar with the Ruslands, that is Russia. And it's a similar phenomenon. That is a conversion that took place at one point, but then complaints among the clergy that the peasants are still practicing their old pagan faiths and rituals, and that was a source of annoyance to the priests.
Well, it's
So
going to be
an incomplete baptism in a sense. Yeah.
it's going to be something that I think is easier to hold on to your roots and your paganism as a form of resistance, especially in that one of the things that you establish in the book is that the people who are indigenous to the region are a second class of citizens in Riga at the time. So that's not going to make me want to take on, the religious beliefs of the overclass. It would make me kind of want to dig my heels in, I think.
Yeah, I suspect that the people living in Riga were thoroughly baptized. It was the peasants living far away where the priests couldn't speak the local languages. That's part of the problem is that the priests maybe can consider it haughtiness or arrogance or ignorance, but for whatever reason, it wasn't the best assignment to get a parish in the countryside, dealing with people who don't know your language and you don't know theirs. So there was a lot of neglect in the countryside. It wasn't until the Swedes came in the 17th century that Christianization became more complete, but by that time it was a Protestant form of Christianity. So
Hmm.
my point is that Catholicism actually had very weak roots among the peasants for a long time.
Yeah, it's all the sand, right? You can't put roots down very well in sand.
Oh, no.
All right, that maybe that was just a cheap joke. But so Riga is being established in a lot of ways by force of will of just one archbishop. And I love how he involves, I think you said five of his siblings, like brothers and half brothers, to establish the city. Like this is a real force of will. What was going on?
So, yeah, we can consider the establishment of the city of Riga in 1201 as a kind of a family project. That is, the founder of the city was Albert of Buxhoveden, if that's how you pronounce his name. In the historical record, his name appears spelled in different ways, which lends itself to different pronunciations. But we'll just call him Albert of Riga. He founds the city in 1201, and he is named. Originally, he was the third bishop of Livonia, but then Riga became a bishopric under Albert. So Albert's project was actually initiated by his own uncle. His own uncle, Hartwig, was Archbishop of Hamburg Bremen, and his aim was to expand the influence of his diocese into these northern regions where you have pagans. So several failed attempts took place in the 1180s under the first two bishops of Riga, Meinhard and Berthold. Perhaps part of the reason was that Meinhard was gentle and did not approach the matter of conversion by force. Berthold came in after that and did use force, but perhaps insufficient force. And what really wowed the people, the indigenous tribes, when Bishop Albert arrived was that he had 23 ships and 500 men. So he means serious business. So Albert takes up this position in Riga at the behest of his own uncle, and then brings over five brothers to become bishops and to enter the knighthood and to assist him in this project of building up the city. So what's really astonishing is how much Albert achieved by the time he died in 1229. It was his job to establish the first churches. It was his job to defend this Christian outpost from pagan attacks, from the Russians for that matter, from Lithuanians. And so Albert finds himself in a position where he has to recruit men every year. Every year he would make the trip back to Germany and try to recruit people to bring them to Riga to continue the struggle against the pagans and to defend this small, isolated, and frightened outpost.
It sounds so familiar to my background in Canadian history, in elementary school and high school, where you have people that have to continually go back and establish roots, bring people over in order to keep a hold on a newly conquered territory. It's so familiar,
Yeah.
this idea of colonization, by at the point of a sword and, in religious terms at the same time.
Yeah, and the hold that the outsiders had was really weak in those first years. Hence the constant need to bring in reinforcements from Germany to establish a crusading force in the region. And moreover, the Germans, I should say, who have arrived there are not really, their roots are thin. They're recent arrivals. They are itinerant merchants in many cases, so they haven't established a permanent residence in Riga. They come in during the trading season. They live to go elsewhere. So it takes a long time, many decades, before Riga develops a community, a German community that has deep roots in the city itself, because the German population was so itinerant. But there was also a native population, that is the Livonians, for example, who were the first to convert over to Christianity. Well, now they need to be protected as well. So they're in the city too. But we find that even though there's always a significant element of indigenous peoples, and by the indigenous peoples, I mean the Livonians and the Latvian tribes, they're present in the city throughout this entire period. That is throughout the Middle Ages. They comprise anywhere from 30 to 40% of the city. They are the porters, they are the builders, they take up all the jobs that Germans don't want to do. They work for pay, in other words, and they do not have rights. So they are completely a lower class. They're oppressed. They dress differently, they speak differently, they have a different job, they wear different clothing, and they do not have the rights of citizenship, which in these cities is an important thing. German cities that are being developed along the Baltic coast in the 13th century are endowed with a German law. So think of Lubeck as being the mother of all these Baltic cities, in the sense that the Lubeck law code will now apply to other cities in the region. So Riga's law code is like a version of the Lubeck law code. And then from Riga, the other Baltic cities will get Riga's law code. But what I'm saying here is that Riga's law code denied citizenship to people who did not own real estate. And the locals did not, the indigenous peoples did not own real estate. That was the preserve of the Germans.
Yes, very convenient, isn't it?
Right. So the Germans dominate the church. The Germans dominate the fighting forces, that is the crusaders and their servants. The Germans dominate the merchant community as well. And so that leaves the indigenous peoples in the position of a servant class.
And so, one of the things that gets established in order to keep order within the city and outside of the city is the military order. So, when it comes to crusading in this region, we generally think of the Teutonic Knights, but at this point, Riga has its own bunch of knights, right?
Right. So the original force was the Order of Sword Brothers that was founded by Albert's assistant Theodoric. And the Sword Brothers were a very modest force. There's in the entire Livonian region, there's never more than a few hundred of them at any given time. But of course, they also have their servants. Every knight has a retinue of people who help them out too. So there are a few hundred knights, a couple hundred knights, maybe 200, and maybe 1,000 or so servants, and then other warriors who also join them in the crusade. They don't have roots in the region. They're not tied to the region. They come in, they fight for a season, they get redemption for their sins, and they go back home. So they don't have any real roots in the region. And so, anyway, back to your question, the Order of Sword Brothers is founded in the moment of the founding of Riga, basically, shortly after it, anyway. Their job is to defend not only Riga, but to defend the Christian outposts that are being established throughout what was called Livonia. And by Livonia, I mean at this time, most of Latvia and southern Estonia, right? All that was considered Livonia. So the Sword Brothers are defending this region. They're setting up a line of castles along the main rivers. And the main rivers are the Daugava River and the Gallia River. So this means the Sword Brothers are going south and they're going north towards Estonia. But they're the first line of defense against any outside attacks, whether they come from Lithuanians or from the local tribes or from Russians. Anyway, the Sword Brothers, they last for about 35 years, and then catastrophe befalls them in 1236, I believe it was. They're engaged in a battle with the Lithuanian forces. And the Lithuanian pagans have this reputation for being particularly ferocious. They managed to resist Christianization longer than any of the other tribes in this region. And they defeat the Sword Brothers in 1236, I believe it was. Most of the Sword Brothers, or at least according to the Chronicles, half of the Sword Brothers died that day. And the remainder, well, they need to find a new place to go. And this is where the Teutonic Knights come in. So the Teutonic Knights were established as a force in the Near East, but they're active now in Prussia as of the early 1200s. And Prussia is separated from Livonia by parts of Lithuania. And so the idea was to create a land bridge that would connect the Teutonic Knights in Prussia to the Christian regions under Livonia that were being established. In any event, the Teutonic Knights will absorb the remaining Sword Brothers and establish a new branch called the Livonian Order as a branch of the Teutonic Knights that's basically autonomous from the Teutonic Knights, but not entirely autonomous. So that's how we end up with that crusading order. And the Livonian Order will try to defend the region, vie for power with the archbishop and with the citizens of the city itself. And that will last much longer than many of the other orders did. That is, it lasts up until its dissolution in the 1500s, in the 16th century, at which time it was a completely anachronistic institution.
It's very interesting to think about the clashes that we can get into now that start up between the Teutonic Knights and the Archbishopric, because they're supposed to be on the same team. They're supposed to be working towards the same goals. And yet this is a major clash for this area for at least 100 years, more than that.
Yeah, the main players here are the Archbishop, who is Albert was a prince bishop of the Holy Roman Empire. So he was theoretically in charge of Riga and the Livonian project. But the knights come in and they want a share. They want land. So Albert makes a deal with them to give them 1/3 of the land. And then that isn't enough for the knights and they demand more. And later on, so they get half the land that is being conquered. And they're becoming a political presence in their own way, in a sense. And so they're rivals with the archbishop. But we also have to add in the city itself, because there is a custom, an ethos even, of autonomy for these cities that are being established by principally by German merchants. They have their own law code that protects their rights and protects their privileges. They have a clear idea of what citizenship is, that is the duties and the rights of citizenship. And so they are leery of lords dominating the city and imposing upon the rights and privileges of the merchants who had done so much to create their feudal charters and to make clear their position in the city. So the result is that you have a three-headed monster in a sense in Riga. That is, you've got knights, you've got the bishop, and later Riga is elevated to an archbishopric in the 1250s, and you have the town council, which represents the merchants. And when you have three people vying for power, it always ends up being two against one. And so usually the rivals were the archbishop versus the order, that is the Livonian order, and the merchants, that is the city council, would basically choose whatever side was most convenient for them at the moment. And the merchants mostly just want to be left alone to trade. They're interested in money. They're not interested in fighting. So whenever confronted with a possibility of violence, I would say they mostly would rather not be fighting. They'd rather just be left alone to make money. But the struggles between the archbishop and the knights often interfere with the merchants' objectives. So anyway, the upshot of this is that there are two major civil wars in Riga between the archbishop and the Livonian order, and they result in changing relationships and changing power dynamics in the city. And they're also pretty horrific for everybody involved. That is, they involve a lot of carnage and a lot of instability. And so I would say that this period from the 13th century right up to the end of the 15th century is a profoundly unstable one in which it's really unclear who is the master of Riga, as I put it in the book. Sometimes it seems like the archbishop has the upper hand. Sometimes it seems like the knights have the upper hand. And the popes just do not know what to do with the region. The papacy is embroiled with its own conflicts in the 14th century. And so the papacy is very distant. They're much more worried about Avignon and they're worried about internal struggles. So it took a long time for the papacy to weigh in on events in the Baltic region. And they often do so with very little force and with very little way to back up their decrees. So basically, it ends up being up to the locals to work out their own issues.
Which is, again, very convenient, right? It's very convenient. And I'm thinking about the Pope, and you mentioned him in the book, Boniface VIII, who in my other work about Philip the Fair is very busy with Philip and doesn't have time for the Baltic. And I won't quiz you on Crusader states and elsewhere in the world, but I just want to remind the listeners, I had Steve Tibble on a few weeks ago talking about Crusader criminals. I guess this is a couple months ago. And it really, I mean, this case, the Baltic states really emphasize the fact that these are people who have all these knightly skills and it's profitable for them to go and conquer other places because then they can have the land that they can have at home. So while you have the actual, I think, genuine missionary impulse, it's also a great way to get yourself some land, establish yourself somewhere else. But one of the things that I think maybe we need to illustrate a bit more clearly is that there's always a season in which you would be battling in the Middle Ages. And it's usually the summer, but that time is longer and shorter. And when it comes to winter in Riga, I mean, this is a massive change from summer in Riga. So can you tell us a little bit about how the winter has affected all of this movement back and forth, especially for the Germans who are coming in to trade or to fight?
Winter means isolation. Riga is, in the context of the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries, very distant from civilization. The trading season was really only limited to 8 months a year for the Hansa cities, that is, the merchant cities that dotted the Baltic area. And in Riga, it was even shorter because it's colder and more miserable and frozen. The Daugava River turns into a sheet of ice for the winter season. So this meant that the people of Riga, especially in these early years, were isolated from the outside world. They're encased by a city wall in what was a very tiny city in these early years, and they are vulnerable. Meanwhile, Bishop Albert is off recruiting military forces in Germany. And so the people who are living in Riga often feel like they're very much on their own. They're concerned about pagan raids, which were still frequent in the early 13th century. So winter must have been a time of profound insecurity for the relatively small number of people who are living in Riga in those early years. And later on, of course, the winter still remains long and miserable. So this means winter is a time when supplies don't come in. So at a time when Riga was very much dependent upon outside supplies, winter could be a very challenging time.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to establish if you're a Western looking city and the Western ships can't get to your harbor, for months at a time, you're going to be vulnerable to the people who are used to traveling over ice, and that is the people who are indigenous or the people who are further away, like the Rus, but might have hostile intentions. So I think that winter is such a huge factor in the story of this city that we really need to emphasize it, you know?
Yeah, winter and geography, the geography itself, the topography, bogs and marshes and rivers, and maybe indigenous tribes like the Lithuanians knew how to navigate the geographical challenges better than the foreigners who were probably scared. We think of these knights as being brave and heroic and fearless, but I imagine if we just use a little bit of empathy, we can imagine just how terrified many of them might have been in this alien environment surrounded by people who might be attacking at any moment. And this is certainly pronounced during these moments of isolation, these months of isolation, like in winter.
Yeah, I mean, it is an insecure place to be, which is probably why a lot of people left in the winter,
Yeah,
left
and it's
people
also
to their
not
own
like
devices.
it's not the ideal posting. If you're a knight, the Near East is a more attractive prospect, right? The Baltic is second rate. So that's why the popes had to upgrade the terms of their service so that you would get full remission of your sins for serving a year, just like you would in the Near East.
Yeah.
It's not the ideal post, not only for the knights who are in this inhospitable location. The land isn't really the best, and it's cold and dreary. And it's also not the greatest posting for bishops and archbishops, for that matter, as well. If you are an ambitious person in the Catholic Church, you want a posting in Italy or in France or in Germany, right? But not way off in the Baltic. So it's not the most promising thing. And in fact, the archbishops are very rarely around in the 14th and 15th centuries. During these struggles with the order, the archbishops are mostly in Rome and Avignon and trying to get the support of the church for their struggles and finding themselves largely ignored by the papacy. So yeah, it was not an attractive posting for these people. Now, for merchants, on the other hand, it is attractive because it's lucrative. There is a lot of wealth to be extracted from the interior of the Baltic coast. So, as I was saying before, the Daugava River leads into the interior, which will take you through Belarus and into Russia. And this is a source of forest products like honey, beeswax, and especially furs. So think of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries as an age long before the Industrial Revolution allowed people to have ample supplies of spun clothing. Instead, people kept themselves warm with furs. And so the Russian interior was abundant with fur-bearing animals. Typically, these were collected by Rus traders or Russian traders, Novgorod being probably the most important city in this regard. Novgorod is located basically east of Estonia, and a land route was created for trade between Novgorod and the Baltic coast, cities like Riga. So the Riga merchants would collect from Novgorod furs and various other forest products and sell them at enormous profits to buyers in the West. So for the merchants, it's attractive to go to this region. And eventually, merchants begin to settle down in the region. For the first 100 years or so, they are itinerant merchants who are traveling back and forth between Lubeck and Riga and other cities. And eventually, the merchants are settling down and they've established these trade links and these contacts in Europe. And during good times, when there isn't a war, they're counting their money. And in bad times, when there are wars, they're experiencing real hardships.
Yeah, they're wrapping themselves up in the furs that they can't sell yet. And when you're
That was
talking
also, by
about,
the way, wearing the furs was one of the ways that the upper crust would distinguish themselves from the lower people in Riga. And it was a very much I hate to use the word apartheid because it's not a racial thing, but there was definitely a distinction between Germans and non-Germans. That is, they didn't even bother to distinguish between the Livonians and the Latvians and the handful of Estonians and Lithuanians who lived in the city. They were simply Undeutsch. And the Undeutsch, they wear homespun clothing and they don't have the adornments that are worn by wealthy merchants and the fur hats and things like that. So even on the streets of Riga, it was pretty clear who is who. The upper crust is dressed better, they're wearing their furs, and the lower people are looking pretty raggedy.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that kind of encapsulates the attitudes of the people in just a couple of words, us and un-us,
Right.
not us. I think that that is a hugely important way of looking at how the stratosphere was how things were stratified in the city. So, yeah, an important distinction for sure. So, Riga gets to be a very important city in that you have these massive amounts of trade, especially between the Rus and Western Europe, Western parts of the region as time goes on. And I should probably mention that when you're talking about like lucrative amounts of furs, we're talking tens of thousands at a time, which is huge, it's massive. So as we start to wrap up our time together, we see that Riga is getting to be very well established. It's a place where people start to want to be because it's so important. Give us a sense of what it looks like now in Latvia when people in this sort of post-Soviet world are looking back to history and establishing their identity. Can you give us a sense of what it's like when the people of Riga are looking back on their history and what they're thinking about these days?
Yeah, I don't know how much the people of Riga today look back on the Middle Ages, but there's clearly a pride that is taken in this early period of Riga, and you can see it in the city in various displays that show, for example, one example would be the cover of my book. The cover of my book shows Riga as a late medieval city around the 1500s. And that image is, I wouldn't say it's ubiquitous in Riga, but Rigans are familiar with it. They've seen this profile of their city before. They take pride in a skyline that fundamentally hasn't changed in 500 years. Rip Van Winkle could have fallen asleep in 1500 and awakened in the year 2000, and a lot would be different, but he would be able to recognize, oh, that's St. Peter's, that is the Dome, St. Mary's, that's St. Jacob's, right? We recognize these things in our skyline. So there is that kind of continuity. And there's certainly attempts going back to the 1930s, historians and archaeologists trying to establish the indigenous roots of Riga. But as far as today is concerned, I don't sense so much a looking back to this ancient past. There's more of a real concern about the present. That is a present day in which Riga is basically divided into two distinct populations, Latvians and Russian speakers. Russian speakers comprise maybe 40% of the city. Their situation is insecure at this moment, especially as the Latvian government, being very concerned about developments in Ukraine and concerned about their own future, the Latvian government tends to see the Russian speakers who have not integrated as a potential fifth column. They receive their news. Many of them have not learned Latvian, so they receive their news from Russian networks, Russian channels, which means from Russia itself. And so that's disconcerting to Riga's authorities. So what they're trying to do right now, as I understand it, is they are encouraging those Russians who want to have a future in Riga and in Latvia to learn the local language, which Russians never had to do before. During the Soviet period, they never had to learn the local language because Russian was the lingua franca of the entire Soviet empire. So they never had to bother learn. So what you have in Riga today are lots of elderly people who've never learned Latvian and whose futures in Riga are now being threatened. They're afraid of deportation, that if they don't learn Latvian and pass the citizenship exam, that they are going to lose their lives in Latvia. And this is happening on a relatively small scale, but enough to be felt by the entire Russian community. And I say Russian community, I should say Russian speaking community, because the Russian speakers may have their roots in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but since Russian was the lingua franca of the Soviet Empire and settling in Riga, Russian was their language. So today, how are they employing the past? Hard to say, except that the claim that Latvia is making that it is European is being emphasized, that Riga has European roots, and that Latvia is historically oriented towards the West rather than the East. Now, the reality is that throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era, Riga was a midpoint between the West and the East. It was a trading post between the West and the East. Even in the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th century, Russia was an exporter of Russian products to the West. Western products were brought to Russia. So Riga has always occupied that position of kind of being between East and West. But it's hard not to recognize that the roots of Riga, in terms of its architecture, its culture, are clearly rooted in the West. The churches that date back to the 13th and 14th centuries are in a very Germanic style, right? Latvian culture itself has a lot of Germanic influence, whether we're talking about Germanic loanwords or we're talking about the culture, like obeying stop signs, for example, or obeying street lights. There's a tendency among the Latvians to go more towards the German disposition to obey the rules rather than what they learned from the Russian side. So there's also this question, for 700 years, Riga was dominated by Germans. So Latvian Regans have had to struggle with both the German legacy and with Sovietization, and to try to establish Riga as basically a Latvian city in which others are welcome, right? That was the idea. But now I think the tolerance and patience of the current Latvian government, I don't know much about the Riga City Council, but the current Latvian government, its patience is wearing thin with the Russian speakers who have not integrated into Latvia. And so they're really pushing them to do so. And maybe the long-term result will be the Latvianization of Riga. In fact, consider the demographic changes that have taken place just over the 20th century. If we were to go back to 1900, the population of Riga would consist of Germans, Latvians, Jews, and Russians. Over time, the Latvians begin to overwhelm the Russians and the Germans. Then in the 1930s, thanks to the arrival of World War II, Hitler calls the Baltic Germans home to the Reich. And so the entire German community is uprooted in 1939, leaving behind the Latvians and a handful of Russians. Then the Soviet period comes, and the Soviets bring in lots of workers and lots of managers who are from the Russian-speaking world, and they take the apartments vacated by the Germans, and they end up in positions of administration for the Soviet regime, and Latvians are pushed to the margins. So it's not surprising then that after 1991, there'd be a pushback from Latvia to assert its Latvianness. In Riga, I think it's less pronounced than it is elsewhere because Riga has always been a multinational city. Riga has always accepted peoples of different faiths and different languages. And for 30 years, there was an attempt to kind of live and let live with the Russian-speaking community. But the war in Ukraine has forced authorities in Riga and in Latvia to make some difficult choices, which are not very welcome by the Russian-speaking community for the most part.
Well, this was another reason I wanted to have you on the podcast, even though your book is now about 5 years old, so I'm late to the party. I think it's essential to look at history, especially when it comes to some countries that are having a sort of like existential moment where they're thinking about what the situation in Ukraine could mean to them. So this is another reason I wanted to have you on to talk about Riga. So finally, as a modern historian, how has this been, dipping into the Middle Ages? Have you found it to be a valuable way of looking at modern history? What would you say to modernists about stepping into the Middle Ages?
It's wild. I had to learn new language in a sense. Actually, I had to learn how to read Fraktur, right? So that was an interesting challenge. What would I say as to modernists?
It's not avoid at all costs.
No, it's not avoid at all costs. I mean, I guess I'm in the position of a senior professor, but when I started the project, I was already tenured and promoted and everything. And so I had the freedom to do what I wanted. So I could take time with this project. And I really did. I started it in 2011, and the book went to press in 2019, right? So it took some time. And maybe part of the reason for that is because of all the tools that I had to acquire to be able to do this project. I was in this other world for so long that I kind of separated them. Now I'm back in the 20th century. The projects I'm working on now are focusing on the 20th century. But where I see the connections are how in the 20th century, historians and political leaders were trying to use the past to justify their own policies in the present. The great example of this that I'm encountering is the Ulmanis dictatorship in the 1930s. Ulmanis was a Latvian leader who wanted to Latvianize the country in the face of all these foreign threats, the Soviet Union, Germany, and internal threats as well. And so the idea was to make Riga, for example, a more Latvian city. Well, what that meant was destroying some elements of the German past. Buildings that were in the German style, they weren't slated for wholesale destruction, but they were definitely the victims of Ulmanis's attempt to make a more Latvian city. I'm not sure that I answered your question very effectively, but as we opened our conversation, there are political uses of history. And we saw them, especially in the 1930s under the Ulmanis regime, absolutely under the Soviets after 1940. That is to make these claims that somehow Russia was involved in this region. And so, therefore, its historic claim to this region has some validity. And now, of course, we're in a new situation altogether. And my sympathies go out to the people of Riga and Latvia who are understandably nervous at this juncture. I'm worried about the future of Riga, frankly.
Yes. So maybe our final thought is we need to learn history so that we can understand the present better and where it comes from and those long legacies that people lean on so that we can maybe understand each other and ourselves a little bit better. Maybe that's where modernity comes into it. What do you think?
Absolutely. I think you can't understand the present without understanding the past. That's what I tell my students all the time. Whether they believe me or not is debatable. But I do win converts over to this idea that history can actually teach us something about the world we're living in right now, for sure. Learning about the history of Riga has been fun, entertaining, deeply challenging because of the tools that I had to acquire to be able to do this, and especially interesting as an outsider. That is, I'm an outsider in two senses. I'm not trained as a medievalist, and I'm not trained as a Latvian historian. I'm trained as a Russian historian. So, in both senses, I'm kind of an outsider. But I think this also lends itself to, I don't want to say an objective perspective, but a perspective that at least approaches some kind of objectivity because I don't have a dog in any of your fights. I'm not
Mhm.
Latvian. I'm not Russian. I don't have any real connection to Riga other than the fact that I visited this place 20 years ago. I fell in love with it. I thought a book needs to be written about this. And so the book ended up being less an academic exploration of Riga and more a love letter to this medieval city whose legacy still continues, but that is fundamentally lost. The walls are gone, the towers are gone. But what I do try to do in this book is to be a tour guide. I try to take people around the city to introduce them to what no longer exists or the ruins and vestiges of what used to be. So I hope that readers who read my book will go to Riga and they will use it as a guide to help them to understand the medieval city and its relationship to the present city.
Well, I'm glad that you visited Riga, fell in love with it, and wrote this book because I think that you will have changed a lot of people's thoughts about it or maybe introduced people to the city that weren't familiar with it before. So thanks so much for stepping into the Middle Ages with me and with the book itself. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Danielle. It's been a real pleasure.
To find out more about Kevin's work, you can visit his faculty page at Gonzaga University. His latest book is The House of Hemp and Butter, A History of Old Riga. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's up, Peter?
Hey. So we're welcoming the Saga Thing podcast to our YouTube channel.
Woohoo!
That is the one by John Sexton, Andrew Frenger. It's been around for, I think, probably one of the longest medieval podcasts there is. And they judge the Icelandic sagas.
I like to see cards being flashed, like 10s across the board.
There are things like that. And they are very thorough in going through the sagas. So there are a few hundred episodes, and look for one to be added every week to our YouTube channel, which is, I'm loving it. We have a lot of podcasts on our YouTube channel. So I guess is a way for people to enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find this podcast on YouTube and
Indeed.
a whole bunch of other ones.
Exactly. You can come online and see that there. But meanwhile, on the main website, we have a new piece by Laura Chevalier about a sport called La Sula Lacrosse.
Which is?
It's just people taking sticks and a ball and whacking around a field, usually between two villages.
So the stakes are high.
It was like village versus village or guild versus guild. It sounds like a lot of fun and a little rough and tumble, occasionally got banned by the French government.
That makes sense.
Laura talks about that. Interesting little sport. And in our new books section, we're profiling this text from the Ming Dynasty, China. In translation, it comes out as 9 volumes. And it's all about medical recipes, thousands of them that were used from like plants and herbs and even fruits and vegetables.
Nice. I love medical stuff. And it's so cool to have this stuff in translation now. It's lovely to see more and more translations so that we can all access stuff from all over the world when we couldn't before.
Yeah. This seems to have been a long-term project by the scholar involved. The original took 27 years to make. So if you want to do a translation, he seems to have been doing it for like 5-10 years at least.
Wow.
You can get the 9-volume version, or there is like a 1-volume of the best of.
Yeah, like a Cole's Notes. Oh, that's very Canadian. I was going to say Reader's Digest, but that's also very Canadian. So, yes, a short version of this 9-volume work. That's awesome. So people can find out information about it on the website.
Indeed. On our new medieval book section.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us all of the stuff that's on the website.
Thanks.
Thank you, as always, to all of you out there whose kind generosity makes my work possible. Whether you're letting the ads play through, telling your friends about my books and podcasts, proudly wearing a 5-Minute Medievalist shirt from tpublic.com, or becoming a patron at patreon.com, your support is greatly appreciated. Patronage is the biggest part of how I pay the bills, so if you love this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon community to help a girl out and keep the medieval content going. You can find out how at patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from ports to shorts, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.